There's a version of you that doesn't argue anymore. You've probably noticed it. The moment you go quiet, the moment you stop filling space with explanation or performance, other people start talking faster. Slightly louder, slightly more insistent, as if your stillness is something they need to push against. Watch it next time. The second you pause before replying, they rush to fill the gap like the silence is dangerous. Doesn't explain itself to people who have already decided not to understand. You've stopped managing people's emotions with your tone. Doesn't perform certainty it doesn't have, or hide the certainty it does. And if I'm honest, this didn't come from confidence. It came from being misunderstood one too many times, from learning at real cost that performing warmth for people who couldn't see you was the most exhausting thing a human being can do. And the strangest thing has been happening around that version of you. People feel it before they can name it. They shift in your presence. Some get quieter, some get inexplicably hostile, not for anything you've done, but for something you've stopped doing. Some start watching you the way you watch someone you haven't figured out yet. Here's what I need you to understand about what's happening. What you've been building without a name, without a framework, isn't a mood. It isn't a phase, meaning your nervous system isn't cooperating with the old version of you anymore. Carl Jung spent 40 years mapping exactly this. He called it the emergence of the self, the point in a person's development where the ego stops running the show, and something older, deeper, and vastly more grounded takes its place. And the reason people around you are behaving strangely. They are in the presence of someone who no longer needs them to be anything, and that is a deeply destabilizing thing for one human being to encounter in another. But here is the trap, and this is precisely why this video matters right now. You will mistake this stillness for coldness, and then you will start performing again to prove you're still warm, still good, and in doing that, you will hand back the most real thing you've developed, and you'll feel yourself disappear in real time. Most people in the Sophia stage do this, not once, repeatedly. Because the performance is familiar, and familiarity feels like safety, even when it is a cage with the door left open. In the next 2 minutes, I'm going to show you the first sign you've crossed into genuine self-authority, the same sign that makes certain people around you turn hostile without a word exchanged. And over the next 25 minutes, the complete Jungian map, where silent authority actually comes from, why it unsettles specific people, the 6 signs that confirm you're developing it, and the one test, the test Jung would give you, that determines whether what you're building is real or the most sophisticated performance of all. The Sophia stage is not a destination you reach. It is a gravitational field you begin to generate, and once you understand its mechanics, you will never misread your own power again. The persona isn't fake, it's expensive. Every day you maintain it, the acceptable version of yourself, the adapted performance, the carefully edited presentation of who you are, it costs you something. Energy, spontaneity, the low-level exhaustion of being slightly not yourself, constantly, around people who wouldn't notice the difference anyway. Jung's word for your socially acceptable self, the version you present to the world, not deception, but necessary adaptation. The problem is never the mask itself. The problem is forgetting you're wearing it. And here is what that actually feels like from the inside, because you have lived this. The version of you that laughed when you didn't find it funny, because the social contract required it. The version that explained itself 3 times when once should have been sufficient, because silence felt dangerous. The version that monitored the emotional temperature of every room before deciding how much of itself to let in. The version that was genuinely good at being whoever the situation needed, and slowly forgot that adaptable and yourself are not the same thing. That was not a character flaw, that was a sophisticated survival strategy. It just wasn't you. Quick check if you leave social time feeling less you, that's persona fatigue. And if it's been getting worse month by month, your psyche is already pulling you out of stage 1, the cost of the performance, and if that cost has been increasing over time, it means the gap between the mask and the person wearing it has been growing, which means you are leaving stage 1. In about 2 minutes, I'm going to show you the exact reason people get angry when you stop performing. It has nothing to do with anything you've done. It is a Jungian mechanism called projection, and once you understand it, you will never again feel guilty about someone else's hostile reaction to your growth. But first, what the mask dissolving actually looks like from the inside. What Jung called persona dissolution happens when the gap between the performance and the actual self becomes psychologically unbearable. Sometimes it's slow erosion, a life that fits like clothes belonging to someone else. Sometimes a rupture, a loss, a crisis, a moment of clarity so complete that going back to the performance feels like a kind of death. Persona dissolution is not a breakdown. It is the first necessary movement toward becoming a whole human being. But here is what nobody warns you about. Once the mask weakens, something else begins pressing forward. Something the ego has been suppressing for years, something darker, more complicated, and if you're willing to face it, the actual source of everything we call silent authority. And it is bad, but it gets dangerous if you don't know what it's doing. Jung had a name for it. Now we go somewhere most conversations about psychology never actually reach. Because you cannot understand silent authority, the kind that makes people go quiet before you've said anything, without understanding the shadow. Everything the ego has refused to be, every trait, impulse, and capacity the conscious self deemed unacceptable and pushed into the unconscious. Jung's essential point: the more the shadow stays unconscious, the more power it has over you, not less. Let me make this concrete, removing all abstraction. From early childhood, every one of us received, through words, through silences, through how people responded when we were most ourselves, very specific messages about which parts of us were acceptable. The parts that weren't welcomed didn't disappear, they went underground. Your anger, if anger wasn't safe, went underground. Your ambition, if ambition made people uncomfortable, went underground. Your sensitivity, if it was called weakness, went underground. Your hunger for something larger than what was being offered to you. You feel it in your chest before you even know what you're reacting to. That pressure, that sudden disproportionate heat in a conversation that shouldn't have this much charge. That's not a personality flaw, that's the shadow announcing itself. All of it went into what Jung called the shadow, where it has been waiting, growing more concentrated ever since. The shadow doesn't punish you for being bad, it punishes you for being unconscious. It doesn't care about your intentions, only what you're willing to see. The unintegrated shadow leaks through disproportionate reactions, through jealousies you can't account for, through the patterns that replay in every relationship regardless of who the other person is. It runs you from below while you maintain the performance of having it together. And here is the paradox that is the foundation of silent authority. The person who has faced their shadow is not the person without darkness. They are the person whose darkness is no longer running them from behind. Think about what that does to a person's presence. The average person spends enormous psychological energy on suppression, managing the parts of themselves they cannot afford to show. That costs energy, and it shows not in any one visible thing, but in a quality of guardedness, of smallness, of performance that other nervous systems detect before a word is spoken. Now contrast that with someone who has looked at their shadow and not flinched, who has acknowledged the anger and integrated it so it becomes directness rather than explosion, who has sat with the grief, the shame, the darkest impulses and come back whole. They are not brighter, they are deeper, and depth in a human being is the most authoritative thing there is. The unconscious mechanism by which we attribute our own unintegrated shadow material to others. We see in them what we cannot yet see in ourselves. Here is what it looks like in real life, in situations you've lived. You set a boundary clearly, calmly, without apology, and someone calls you selfish. Not because the boundary was unreasonable, because the part of them that desperately needs to set boundaries has never once been allowed to exist. You stop over-explaining yourself, you give a clear answer and leave it there, and someone calls it arrogance. Not because you were arrogant, because your absence of compulsive justification mirrors back their own exhausting need to justify everything. You go quiet in a conflict instead of escalating, and someone says you're cold, distant, you don't care. Not because you've withdrawn, because your regulation in the face of their dysregulation is the most confronting thing they have encountered. They are not reacting to you, they are reacting to what you represent, the integration they have never been willing to do. Your calm is not an accusation, but it lands like one. And understanding that distinction is what allows you to stop absorbing their reactions as information about your failure. Now you understand what the shadow is and what integration does to a person's presence. What you need now is the map, the architecture of how this actually develops, 4 stages, one specific sequence, and one stage where almost everyone stops because it requires what the ego will do almost anything to avoid. Let me show you exactly where you are. Jung mapped the individuation process with a precision most people who reference his work have never actually read. 4 stages, as I name each one, don't intellectualize it. Locate yourself. Where you are in this map explains exactly why your relationships are behaving the way they are right now. Stage 1, persona identification. The persona is intact, functioning. Life is organized around fitting correctly into the expectations of the tribe, family, profession, culture. The ego believes it is the whole self. It doesn't feel the gap, or when it does, it fills it with achievement, distraction, or a louder version of the performance. Jung called this the first half of life, the necessary work of adapting to the external world, not pathological, developmental, but not the destination. Self-placement, if your default response to discomfort is to work harder, achieve more, become better at the performance, rather than to question whether the performance itself is the problem, you are in stage 1, not as judgment, as location. Right arrow, and once the performance begins to cost more than it returns, stage 2 begins. It rarely asks permission. Stage 2, the confrontation, the wound that opens the door. Something breaks. A loss the persona cannot absorb and perform its way through. A relationship that ends and takes a version of your identity with it. Or the slow accumulation, the growing, undeniable sense that the life you have built does not fit the person you actually are. Jung's collaborator Marie-Louise von France described it precisely. The individuation process generally begins with a wounding of the personality, an impasse the ego cannot resolve alone, which forces it toward the deeper center Jung called the self. The wound is not the obstruction, the wound is the doorway. If your life looks completely functional from the outside, the right markers, the right relationships, but from the inside it feels hollow, muted, or like you are watching it happen to someone else, that is not ingratitude. That is persona fatigue at its limit, the signal that you are standing at the edge of stage 2. The disorientation you feel is not breakdown. It is your psyche refusing to stay smaller than what you've actually become. Right arrow stage 3 is where almost everyone stops, because it requires the one thing the ego will do almost anything to avoid. Stage 3, the shadow integration, the descent. This is the stage that separates genuine psychological authority from a more sophisticated performance of it. The shadow must be faced. Not intellectualized, not understood at arm's length. Faced with the lights on. The anger you've been calling passion, the need for control dressed up as high standards. All of it without the familiar escape routes. And here's the thing Jung discovered that changes how you understand this entirely. The shadow is not only darkness. It also holds everything that was suppressed in service of the persona, extraordinary vitality, creative force, the full range of being fully human. The person who integrates their shadow doesn't just become less reactive. They become more alive because they are no longer spending half their psychological energy on suppression. The shadow integrated is not the shadow eliminated. It is the shadow in service, the directed force of everything you once refused to be, now available to the whole person. Right arrow, and when stage 3 goes deep enough, stage 4 begins to emerge on its own, without announcement. Stage 4, the emergence of the self, silent authority. Not the ego self. The self in Jungian terms is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious unified, the organizing center of the whole personality, the part that was always whole, waiting for the ego to stop running from it. When the ego stops desperately defending the persona, stops at war with the shadow, stops running on the fuel of external validation, what emerges is exactly what you have been developing. A quality of presence that requires nothing from the room to feel complete. A stillness that is not withdrawal but arrival. A silence that is not emptiness but fullness that has nothing left to prove. This is silent authority, not the authority of power over others, the authority of someone who has claimed power over themselves. These 6 signs cannot be performed. If you try to imitate them, people will feel it. Silent authority is not a set of behaviors you adopt. It is what becomes visible when integration has actually happened. These are not things you decide to do. They are things that begin to happen, signs that the rearrangement is real. The world provokes you, and there is a gap. Where once your response was immediate and reflexive, there is now a pause, a breath, a moment of genuine choice between stimulus and response. In Jungian terms, this is the signature of an ego no longer being run by unconscious complexes, the emotionally charged automatic patterns that used to fire before a single conscious decision was made. When a complex is brought into consciousness, it loses its autonomy. It still exists, but it no longer fires without your awareness. The pause is not passivity. It is the first evidence of genuine psychological sovereignty. People around you will feel this as unreadable. They probe, they push, they provoke, and instead of the reaction they were primed for, they get stillness. That stillness is not indifference. It is the silence of someone who is no longer being controlled. People start managing their behavior differently in your presence, less willing to gossip, less likely to wear the exaggerated version of themselves they usually perform. Conversations built on mutual pretending tend to die when you arrive, not because you said anything, but because your presence shifts the atmospheric pressure. The Jungian mechanism, most social interaction is persona to persona, mask meeting mask. There is an unspoken agreement: I won't look too closely at yours if you don't look too closely at mine. When one person has genuinely stopped operating from the persona, that agreement becomes one-sided. You're no longer playing the game, and your refusal to play it in silence puts everyone else's performance into stark relief. You become, in Jung's framework, an unwilling mirror. Some people will resent you for it, and some will quietly respect you for it. Both responses are about what you represent, not what you've done. Right arrow as the presence shifts, the third sign follows quietly, in the private moments when no one is watching. Someone misunderstands you, misrepresents you, says something untrue about you, and instead of the urgent need to correct, defend, and restore the accurate version, there is something else. A quietness, a genuine willingness to let it be. In Jungian psychology, the compulsion to correct and defend is rooted in persona anxiety, the fear that if the mask is seen incorrectly, something essential will be lost. When the persona is no longer your identity, when your sense of self comes from the inside rather than from the management of others' perceptions, the correction becomes optional, not because truth doesn't matter, because your selfhood no longer depends on their version of it. The most authoritative thing you can do in a room full of people performing certainty is to have nothing to prove. People will feel this as power before they can explain it as wisdom. Right arrow as the need to defend dissolves, something changes in how emotion moves through you, and the fourth sign is where that becomes most visible. The unintegrated shadow turns anger into explosion, or inward as depression, or into passive aggression, the controlled detonation of someone who cannot acknowledge what they feel. When the shadow is integrated, anger transforms into what the Jungian tradition calls directed force, precise, proportionate, available when genuinely needed and absent when not. You can be angry without being rage. You can disagree without needing capitulation. You can draw a boundary without requiring the other person to validate why you drew it. Integrated anger is not the absence of fire. It is fire under your own governance. This quality, clean, proportionate, unsentimental force, is one of the most recognizable signatures of genuine Jungian authority. It is the energy that makes entire rooms shift in their seats before you have raised your voice. Right arrow sign 5 is more internal. It happens in your relationship with uncertainty itself. Jung believed psychological maturity is precisely the capacity to hold tension between opposites without collapsing into one side. The immature ego needs resolution, the argument settled, the ambiguity eliminated, complexity reduced to a clean answer. This is not stupidity. It is the ego's instinct for the safety of certainty. The person who can sit with "I don't know" without it threatening their identity, who can hold two contradictory truths simultaneously, becomes, in a room of reactive certainty, the most stabilizing presence in the space. Not because they have all the answers, because they are not afraid of the questions. Right arrow all 5 shifts converge into the 6th sign, the one people feel before they can name it. The final sign and the most felt. Most people's silence is a waiting room. They are quiet because they are preparing to speak, gathering, managing, planning the next performance. Their silence is a pause in the activity, not an absence of it. The silence of someone in the Sophia stage is a different substance entirely. It doesn't wait, it doesn't prepare, it doesn't manage. It simply occupies the space with a quality of presence most rooms have never encountered and cannot easily name. Jung's point about individuation was that it frees the enormous energy previously consumed by suppression. That freed energy doesn't vanish. It settles into the body, into the breath, into the quality of attention that people feel when they're near you before you've said a word. Your silence has weight because it is full, and fullness, in a world of people performing to fill their emptiness, is the rarest and most authoritative thing there is. I want to say something that most people in your life will never be able to say to you directly. Not because they don't care, because they don't have the framework, and because what they're actually feeling is too uncomfortable to name. The person developing genuine silent authority is psychologically threatening to a very specific category of people. Not everyone, not randomly, specifically, the person whose persona is still their complete identity, the person whose shadow remains entirely unexamined, the person who depends, consciously or not, on everyone around them participating in the same performance. For that person, someone who has stopped performing is not simply different. They are an existential confrontation. When we encounter in another person a quality that lives in our own unintegrated shadow, calm we can't access, clarity we've never allowed ourselves, freedom from approval we secretly hunger for, we cannot observe it neutrally. We either idealize it or we attack it. And what the unintegrated person sees when they look at someone with genuine silent authority. They see freedom from the need for approval, which mirrors their own imprisoned need for it. They see comfort with silence, which mirrors their own desperate need to fill it. They see someone who doesn't justify themselves, which mirrors their own compulsive self-justification. They see someone who is complete, which holds up a mirror to their own fragmentation. Your wholeness is a mirror they didn't ask to stand in front of, and some people would rather break the mirror than look at what it's showing them. And here is what I want you to hold alongside that. They are not wrong for being where they are. They are defending the only identity they have ever had, the only self-concept that has kept them safe, given them belonging, offered them a way to exist without falling apart. Attacking the mirror feels to them like survival. And I want to be honest with you, I've been the defended person too. I've been the one who felt threatened by someone's calm, who called stillness arrogance because it showed me something I didn't want to see. This isn't a hierarchy, it's a map, and most of us have been at multiple points on it. You don't trigger them because you're better, you trigger them because you're freer. And freedom, to someone who has never allowed themselves to want it, looks exactly like a threat. The attacks are never about you, they are about the road they haven't yet been willing to take. And something most people in this stage don't have anyone to say to them. The loneliness of individuation is real. Not the loneliness of being unwanted, the loneliness of being present, genuinely caring, fully engaged, and still feeling the gap between the depth you are capable of and the depth most interactions are willing to go. It is sitting in a room full of people who love you and feeling the distance between what is being said and what is actually true. And the people trying to convince you that your growth is arrogance are often the ones you love most, because a mirror in the hands of someone you love is the hardest one to look away from. That is not a reason to shrink. It is a reason to grieve and to keep going anyway. But here is the question all of this raises, and it is the most important one in this video. How do you know whether what you've developed is genuine? How do you know whether your stillness is real integration or the most elaborately constructed performance of all? Jung had a precise answer, and it's the one most people in this niche never say. Here is the distinction most people in this conversation never make. Approach this with honest inquiry, not self-attack, not defensiveness. Because the Sophia stage can be mimicked. And the mimic, the counterfeit, is one of the most sophisticated psychological traps in the entire individuation journey. Jung called it ego inflation. When the ego identifies with the self rather than serving it, the ego mistakes contact with deeper psychological content for its own achievement and expansion. The result is not authority, it is grandiosity wearing the costume of wholeness. Everyone who walks the individuation path touches inflation at some point. It is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of contact. The question is never whether you've touched it, it's whether you're willing to see it when you do. If any of what follows feels familiar, that's not failure, that's awareness. And awareness is the beginning of the real thing. Ego authority is loud in its quietness. It performs non-attachment in a way that still requires being observed as non-attached. It tells you with great calm authority that it doesn't care what you think, and it carefully monitors whether you noticed. It has shed one mask, and immediately put on the mask of the person who has shed masks. Its shadow, it announces, has been integrated, but the people who trigger it most are precisely the ones who represent the parts it still hasn't been willing to face. The ego inflated by spiritual development is not more free than before. It is more elaborately imprisoned in a cage that looks from the outside like a palace. Self-authority is quiet in a different way. Not performing its own stillness, simply still because the work that generates stillness has been done, is being done, will always be ongoing. It can be seen incorrectly and not spiral. It can receive genuine criticism and actually consider it without crumbling or dismissing. It can hold "I was wrong about this" and "I am whole" at the same time, because it does not need to be perfect in order to be complete. The self isn't purity, it's honesty, and the willingness to see yourself clearly without collapse is itself the evidence of integration. Here is the test, the simplest one. Ego authority needs an audience. Self-authority can withstand being completely misunderstood and feel no urgency to correct it. Not, can you stay calm when people agree with you? Can you stay whole when they don't? Can you be misread, misrepresented, unseen, and still know who you are, not because you've argued for it, but because you have lived it from the inside? That knowing, quiet, undefended, self-generated, is what silent authority actually is. And it cannot be performed, only built, one integration at a time. 5 questions, be honest. Do you notice a gap now between what happens and how you respond that wasn't there before? Does performing, laughing when you don't mean it, agreeing when you don't believe it, cost you more now than it used to? When someone projects onto you, calls your stillness arrogance, your boundary selfishness, can you feel in your body the difference between their story and your reality? Do you find your anger cleaner than before, less leaking, more directed, genuinely quiet when it isn't needed? Can you sit with "I don't know" without it threatening the ground beneath you? Less defending, more choosing, less performing, more presence, less needing to be understood, more being yourself anyway. 4 or 5. You are in the arc right now. And what you're becoming, the stillness, the depth, the quality of silence that people feel before you speak. Jung spent his life studying what happens when a human being becomes genuinely themselves. Not the adapted version, not the managed version, not the one assembled to be acceptable. The whole version, shadow and light, wound and wisdom, darkness consciously carried rather than unconsciously given to everyone they love. He called it individuation, and he was brutally honest about what it costs. It costs you the comfort of the persona, the familiar, expensive mask. It costs you the false security of an unexamined life. It costs you the relationships built around the version of you that no longer exists. It costs you the approval of people who needed you to stay exactly as you were. But what it returns, what it gives back, cannot be taken from you. A quality of presence that doesn't need to argue for itself. A silence that carries weight. A self that is no longer a stranger. You're not losing your life, you're shedding the version that couldn't carry the one that's coming. At the start of this video, I described a version of you that doesn't argue anymore. That doesn't explain itself, that doesn't perform warmth it doesn't feel. The reason people around you don't know how to place it is that they can't find your old mask anymore, and they don't know what to do with what's underneath it. The world doesn't know what to do with someone who has stopped needing the world to tell them who they are. That is not a problem to solve, that is the arrival. Stay in it, keep going. One question in the comments. Which sign landed hardest, the silence or the pause? Just type the word. I read every single one. And if this gave someone a framework for something they've been living without a name for, share this with them. The right map at the right moment genuinely changes things. Right over there is the video that began this series, exactly why the people around you start acting strange when you enter the Sophia stage, and the 7 specific behaviors you'll see. If this one resonated, that one will too. I'll see you there.